I was born and raised on my family's ranch, a wide stretch of rolling land that stretched farther than the eye could see, filled with cattle, horses, cornfields, and the echo of hard work that ran in our bloodline for generations. The ranch wasn't just a piece of property, it was the foundation of my family's pride, a place where every fence post carried a story, every barn beam held the weight of sweat, and every acre was a reminder of the sacrifices made by those who came before me. Out here, we didn't just live, we thrived on resilience, independence, and a sense of belonging that no piece of paper or outside authority could strip away. Yet, in today's world, people with clipboards and inflated egos often thought they could trespass on that heritage with rules, fines, and power games. I had long since learned to ignore their chatter, but what happened recently tested every ounce of patience I had. It all started with a woman known in the community as Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of every neighborhood she infected. Her reputation preceded her: demand letters, HOA complaints, threats over mailbox colors, barking dogs, and even grass height. People rolled their eyes when her name was mentioned, but I never imagined she would cross into my world, my land, my ranch that stood far outside the manicured cul-de-sacs and chain-linked subdivisions she haunted. The thing about people like her is that they don't know boundaries until someone like me teaches them the meaning of the word. The first time Karen showed up, she arrived in a polished SUV, the kind of vehicle that screamed suburban comfort rather than country grit. She stepped out wearing a wide-brimmed hat that looked more decorative than functional, oversized sunglasses, and a blazer entirely impractical for the dusty road she had driven on. I was repairing a section of fence near the cattle pasture when I noticed her strutting toward me with a folder in hand, like she was serving papers or presenting a lecture. She cleared her throat, introduced herself as the HOA president, and then began rattling off a list of violations she claimed I was guilty of. My barns, she said, weren't compliant with community standards. My cattle, she claimed, posed a risk to neighborhood safety. My ranch entrance sign, carved by my grandfather himself, didn't match the approved aesthetics of the area. I leaned against the fence post, wiped the sweat from my brow, and let her finish her tirade before I answered with a calm laugh. This wasn't her world, this was mine. What she didn't know, and what I wasn't about to tell her just yet, was that not only was I exempt from her overblown authority, I was, in fact, the governing body above every single HOA in the nation. That truth was my ace in the hole, one I carried like a loaded pistol, ready to be drawn when the moment demanded it. For now, I let her spew nonsense while I took measure of the storm she was trying to bring into my life. Over the next week, Karen escalated her campaign. I received a string of letters, each one with official-looking headers, citations of bylaws, and threats of fines that would never see the light of day. She sent pictures of my ranch entrance to some faceless board, claiming I was an uncooperative member of the community. What community? My land wasn't part of her HOA jurisdiction, never had been, never would be. I wasn't subject to her made-up rules, but her arrogance blinded her to that reality. Then came the final straw, a notice demanding that I vacate my own ranch within 30 days or face forced eviction through HOA authority. I almost choked on my morning coffee when I read those words. The gall it took for someone to stand on land they didn't own, addressing a man whose family had been there for over a century, and declare that she could take it away, it was laughable. But instead of reacting in anger, I felt a calm rise in me, the kind of calm you get when you know you hold the cards no one else realizes exist. I folded the letter neatly, set it on the kitchen counter, and decided it was time to show Karen just how deep her mistake ran. The next time she came marching up my driveway, I was waiting on the porch. She carried more papers, more threats, more attempts at control, and she delivered them with the condescending tone of a schoolteacher scolding a child. I let her finish, just as before, then stood up, walked down the steps, and looked her dead in the eye. Karen, I said, slow and steady, you've made a mistake. This ranch isn't just mine, it's protected by authority that goes way beyond your HOA. You see, I don't just own this land. I govern every HOA nationwide. The silence that followed was heavier than a thundercloud before a storm. She blinked, her lips parted in disbelief, as if she thought she misheard me. But I didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't give her a shred of doubt that what I said was the truth. And it was. Years ago, through my work in law and policy, I had been appointed to a federal oversight position, one that placed me squarely above every HOA board, president, and committee in the country. Their rules only existed under the framework I authorized, their power nothing more than borrowed authority from the system I oversaw. Karen wasn't just picking a fight with a rancher, she was poking the very bear that defined the wilderness she thought she controlled. From that moment, the game changed. She tried to laugh it off at first, dismissing me as some backwoods man spinning tall tales. But when I showed her the federal credentials, the signed documents, and the legal statutes she had likely never read, her face drained of color. She stammered, tried to backpedal, insisted she only wanted compliance and fairness, but her words carried no weight anymore. I let her walk away that day with her pride cracked but not shattered, because I wanted her to stew in the realization of what she had stepped into. She had tried to evict me from my own ranch without realizing I was the one person in this country who could dissolve her entire HOA with a single stroke of a pen. And believe me, the temptation was there. But I wasn't interested in petty revenge, not yet. Instead, I let her efforts continue, documenting every move she made, building a record of her abuse of power, because when I finally chose to act, it would be decisive, final, and unforgettable. Out here on the ranch, patience isn't just a virtue, it's survival. And I had all the patience in the world to watch Karen dig her own grave, one complaint at a time. Karen's pride wouldn't let her retreat quietly. After our last encounter, she seemed more determined than ever to prove her dominance, as though losing ground to me had wounded her ego beyond repair. I noticed the small ways she tried to assert herself. She parked her SUV just outside my ranch gates, pretending to monitor compliance. She began knocking on my neighbors' doors, spinning stories about how my cattle were trespassing hazards, and my barns were illegal structures. She even staged little photo sessions, pointing her phone at my ranch while muttering notes into a recorder like she was preparing evidence for a courtroom battle. The absurdity of it all would have been comical if it weren't so invasive. I'd be feeding my horses or riding the fence line, only to catch a glimpse of her figure in the distance, standing with crossed arms and that smug tilt of her chin. She reminded me less of an HOA president and more of a petty tyrant desperate to maintain relevance. Out here in the wide openness of the plains, people like her didn't last long. But Karen wasn't ready to learn that lesson yet. Instead, she doubled down on her attacks, forcing me to prepare my counter in a way she couldn't possibly anticipate. One of the first things she attempted was summoning county inspectors to my ranch. I woke one morning to find 2 trucks pulling up the gravel driveway, their doors emblazoned with official logos. Out stepped 2 men in button-up shirts, clipboards in hand, looking more nervous than authoritative. They introduced themselves politely enough, but their tone carried the weight of, "We don't want to be here." When I asked what brought them out, they glanced at each other before admitting that a concerned resident had filed multiple complaints about safety hazards and zoning violations. I didn't need to ask who the resident was, I could practically smell the perfume of Karen's meddling. I invited the inspectors in, offered them coffee, and walked them through every inch of the property. By the time we were finished, they looked more impressed than critical. They signed off on everything, declaring the ranch not only compliant but a model of safe agricultural practice. Before leaving, one of them shook my hand firmly and whispered, "We've dealt with her before. Don't let her get under your skin." I chuckled, reassured that her reach was nothing more than a mosquito bite compared to the immunity I carried. Still, I tucked away that experience as another piece of evidence. Every failed attempt she made painted her into a corner she wouldn't escape. Her next strategy was more theatrical. One Saturday morning, I looked out my window to see a crowd gathering near the ranch entrance. Karen had rallied a small group of HOA loyalists, armed with protest signs, megaphones, and matching T-shirts that screamed, "Protect our community." The irony was rich, not a single one of them lived anywhere near my ranch. They were suburbanites, lured into Karen's web of drama, standing on dusty country soil they didn't understand. They chanted slogans about keeping neighborhoods safe and removing hazards, as if my cattle were plotting a coup against their manicured lawns. I saddled my horse, rode down to the gate, and watched them for a while, saying nothing. When Karen spotted me, she strutted to the front, raised her megaphone, and declared to the crowd that I was illegally occupying land and refusing lawful HOA directives. Her voice carried like nails on a chalkboard. Finally, I dismounted, walked to the gate, and pulled out a document I had been saving for just such a performance. It was my federal authority certification, signed, sealed, and framed in legality that none of them could deny. I held it high enough for them all to see. This, I said, my voice steady and clear, is the authority that governs every HOA in the nation. You follow rules that I allow to exist. And this ranch? It's mine, protected beyond your reach. You're trespassing. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Karen's bravado faltered as her followers exchanged confused looks. Some began shuffling back toward their cars, suddenly realizing they were pawns in a game they didn't understand. Within minutes, the crowd dispersed, leaving Karen fuming alone at the gate. I didn't gloat. I simply tipped my hat, turned my horse, and rode back to the ranch house, the weight of my authority hanging in the air like a thunderclap she couldn't ignore. But Karen was not one to accept defeat gracefully. Her obsession with winning drove her to extremes I hadn't predicted. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in streaks of fire, I caught sight of headlights creeping along the fence line. Curious, I grabbed my rifle, not out of fear, but precaution, and headed toward the noise. There she was again, her SUV parked half in the ditch, as she stumbled along the fence with a flashlight. She was taking pictures, measuring posts, scribbling notes. When I confronted her, she snapped that she was documenting violations. I laughed and asked what violations she thought existed on land explicitly exempt from her HOA. That's when she crossed a line. She accused me of forging federal documents and threatened to have me arrested for impersonation. My patience thinned, but I held steady. Karen, I said coldly, do you realize what you're saying? Do you understand that accusing a federal officer of forgery is a crime in itself? Her flashlight trembled in her hand. She tried to bluster, tried to recover her confidence, but the fear in her eyes betrayed her. I didn't press charges that night. I could have, easily, but I let her walk away again, weighed down by the realization that her war against me was more dangerous for her than it ever would be for me. Over the following months, Karen's war spiraled into a campaign of desperation. She filed lawsuits, every one of them thrown out before reaching trial. She flooded the local sheriff's office with noise complaints, trespassing reports, and safety concerns, none of which held water. She even tried to bribe a surveyor into redrawing the boundaries of my land, a scheme so outrageous that when it came to light, the surveyor himself filed a complaint against her for harassment. Through it all, I remained steady, unshaken. My cattle grazed, my fields flourished, and the ranch continued as it always had, untouched by her claws. What she didn't understand, and perhaps never would, was that people like her thrived on conflict in environments where others bent under pressure. But out here, where storms tested you, where droughts humbled you, and where every sunrise demanded grit, people like me didn't bend. We stood. And Karen, for all her bluster, was a storm without rain, a fire without fuel, a fight without power. She had already lost, though her pride kept her from admitting it. I was patient, waiting for the day she would finally break. Because I knew it was coming. Pride always cracks under the weight of reality. By the time summer rolled around, Karen's crusade against me had transformed into something darker, more personal, as if she had convinced herself that defeating me was her destiny. I saw it in the way she lingered outside the ranch gates, sometimes for hours, scribbling notes and snapping photos that no one wanted to see. I saw it in the flyers she distributed around town, claiming I was illegally occupying protected land and endangering the community. She even launched a website, plastered with her distorted stories and half-baked conspiracy theories, branding me as a dangerous squatter hiding behind fake authority. Most people laughed at her antics, dismissing her as the same nuisance they had always known her to be. But there was a small fraction, the gullible, the easily swayed, who gave her attention, who whispered in diners and shops about the man out on the ranch fighting the HOA. For me, the gossip was nothing but background noise. My authority was undeniable, my credentials irrefutable, my land unshakably mine. But I understood something Karen didn't: the louder a desperate person screams, the more obvious their weakness becomes. So I let her scream, building her own downfall one outrageous claim at a time. Still, her persistence began to interfere with the peace of my daily life. Ranching is demanding work. From dawn till dusk, there's always something to tend to: mending fences, rotating cattle, checking irrigation, harvesting feed. It's work that requires focus, patience, and a clear head. Yet more than once, I'd be in the middle of driving cattle when Karen's SUV would creep along the road, her phone aimed like a weapon, recording every move. Once, while I was fixing a broken water line, she shouted across the ditch about illegal modifications to county utilities. Another time, she had the gall to step onto my property, her heels sinking into the dirt as she yelled about unauthorized livestock. Each encounter tested my patience, but I reminded myself of the truth: she wasn't my equal in this fight. She was a fly buzzing around a bull, an annoyance, not a threat. Still, every note she jotted, every false claim she filed, was another piece of rope she wrapped around her own neck. And I was content to let her pull it tighter. The turning point came when Karen tried to stage an emergency HOA hearing about my ranch. She booked the community center in town, invited local officials, and plastered flyers promising a reckoning for lawbreakers. I hadn't planned on attending. After all, no HOA had jurisdiction over my land, and no hearing held any weight against me. But curiosity got the better of me. I walked into that room wearing my work clothes, dusty boots, denim, and a weathered hat, while Karen stood at the front in a tailored suit, her hair perfectly styled, her voice dripping with self-importance. She had gathered maybe 20 people, half of whom looked bored before she even began. For an hour, she ranted about my ranch, presenting her evidence on a projector, blurry photos, misinterpreted documents, and dramatic claims that had no basis in law. When she finished, she raised her chin high, as if she had delivered a closing argument worthy of the Supreme Court. That's when I stood up, walked to the front, and pulled out my federal certification once again. I read aloud the statutes that placed me above every HOA in the country, statutes signed into law long before Karen ever set foot in this town. The room fell silent. A few chuckles rippled through the audience. One man even asked aloud, "Then why are we here?" Karen's face flushed crimson, her lips trembling with rage, but she had no rebuttal. Her so-called hearing collapsed into embarrassment, and by the time I walked out, most of her audience had already left, shaking their heads at the spectacle. That day, her credibility took a blow she would never recover from. But humiliation only fueled her obsession. In the weeks that followed, Karen's behavior crossed the line from nuisance into harassment. She began showing up at night, her headlights sweeping across my fields like searchlights. Once, I caught her attempting to climb the fence near the cattle pen, a tape measure dangling from her hand. Another time, I woke to find her SUV parked near the barn, tire tracks gouging the earth, as if she had been circling the property like a predator. I called the sheriff more than once, but by the time deputies arrived, she was gone, leaving nothing but dust and frustration in her wake. The deputies sympathized but admitted their hands were tied unless she caused real damage. I didn't blame them, they had bigger problems to handle than chasing a meddling HOA president through the countryside. Still, I began to realize that Karen wasn't just a bureaucratic nuisance anymore. She was unraveling, consumed by a war she couldn't win, driven by pride that blinded her to reason. And that kind of desperation, I knew, could become dangerous if left unchecked. One particular night made that danger crystal clear. The moon hung low, casting silver light across the ranch, when I heard a strange crackling sound near the southern pasture. Grabbing my lantern, I rode out to investigate. My heart clenched when I saw the source, smoke rising from a pile of hay bales stacked near the fence. The flames were small but growing fast, licking upward with the hunger of dry summer air. I dismounted, grabbed the emergency water tank I always kept nearby, and doused the fire before it could spread. The smell of gasoline lingered in the air, unmistakable, and my gut told me exactly who was behind it. Karen had crossed the line from harassment into arson. I reported the incident immediately, and while the sheriff took my statement, he admitted it would be hard to prove without catching her in the act. But I didn't need proof to know the truth. From that night forward, I tightened security around the ranch, motion lights, cameras, reinforced gates. If Karen thought she could scare me into leaving my land, she was sorely mistaken. Instead, she had handed me the final piece of evidence I needed to bring her world crashing down. All it would take now was patience, and the right moment to strike. After the fire incident, something shifted inside me. I had been patient long enough, letting Karen pile up mistake after mistake, waiting for her to dig herself into a pit so deep she couldn't crawl out. But arson wasn't just a nuisance, it was a threat to my ranch, my livelihood, and my legacy. I knew if she was willing to set fire to hay bales, it was only a matter of time before she tried something worse, something that could cost me cattle, crops, or even lives. That night, after I put out the flames and secured the ranch, I sat on my porch with a cup of black coffee and laid out my plan. I wasn't going to just defend myself anymore. I was going to end this once and for all. The beauty of my position, one Karen had failed to grasp, was that I had the full weight of federal authority behind me. Every HOA in the nation existed under my oversight, and every president, every board member, answered ultimately to me. Up until now, I hadn't leveraged that power against her, choosing instead to let her spin herself into knots. But she had crossed a line, and now it was time to pull every lever at my disposal. The next morning, I made a few phone calls. Not to the sheriff, not to the county, but to the federal office that handled HOA compliance nationwide. I explained the situation in detail, her harassment, her false claims, her misuse of authority, and finally, the attempted arson. By the time I was finished, I could hear the outrage in the voice on the other end of the line. Within days, an investigation was launched, not into me, but into her. Federal auditors, legal officers, and compliance agents descended quietly into the picture, gathering records, subpoenaing emails, reviewing her financial statements, and interviewing members of her HOA. What they uncovered was worse than I expected. Karen hadn't just been harassing me, she had been abusing her position for years, levying unlawful fines, misappropriating HOA funds, and intimidating residents who challenged her. She had built her little kingdom on lies, and the foundation was crumbling fast. When the evidence reached my desk, I didn't feel triumph. I felt relief. Finally, her madness would be exposed not just to me, but to everyone she had tormented for years. But before the hammer could fall, Karen made one last desperate move. Perhaps sensing that her empire was collapsing, she stormed onto my ranch one afternoon with a group of her loyalists, waving papers and shouting threats. They claimed they had a court order, though anyone with sense could see it was a forgery. She marched up my porch steps, shouting that I was finished and evicted, while her followers filmed the scene on their phones, hoping to capture her so-called victory. I stood calmly, hands resting on the porch railing, and let her rant. When she finally shoved the papers in my face, I took them, skimmed them, and laughed. "Karen," I said, my voice steady but sharp, "this isn't a court order. It's a fraud. And fraud, especially against a federal officer, is a felony." The color drained from her face, but before she could retreat, headlights appeared at the end of the drive. Two black SUVs rolled up, and out stepped federal agents in suits, badges flashing in the afternoon sun. The timing couldn't have been more poetic. They approached, asked for Karen by name, and when she stammered in confusion, they informed her she was under federal investigation. The look on her face when the cuffs clicked around her wrists was something I'll never forget, a mix of disbelief, rage, and the dawning realization that her reign of terror was over. The fallout was swift and merciless. News spread across the community like wildfire: the infamous HOA president, arrested on charges of fraud, harassment, and misuse of funds. Residents who had once cowered under her authority stepped forward with stories of her bullying, her intimidation, her endless demands. The HOA board dissolved under federal order, its funds frozen, its bylaws declared void. For the first time in years, people in her neighborhood could breathe without fear of fines for the color of their shutters or the length of their grass. Some even came out to my ranch to thank me, bringing pies, shaking my hand, and expressing gratitude that I had stood up to her when no one else could. I told them the truth: I hadn't fought for glory or recognition. I had fought because land, heritage, and freedom aren't things you surrender to petty tyrants. Out here, those things mean everything. And if you let someone like Karen take them, even a little, you lose more than property, you lose the backbone of who you are. But even as Karen sat in custody, her downfall wasn't the end of the story. The investigation into her HOA uncovered a web of corruption that reached farther than anyone expected. Other HOA presidents, inspired by Karen's arrogance, had been bending rules, extorting residents, and misusing funds across the state. With my oversight role, I now had the chance to make an example out of them all. I drafted new federal directives, tightening restrictions, demanding transparency, and holding every HOA accountable in ways they had never been before. For years, people had complained that HOAs had too much unchecked power. Now, under my watch, that power was reined in. Karen's war against me had accidentally sparked reform that would protect homeowners nationwide. And while I never sought to be a hero, I couldn't deny the satisfaction of knowing that my struggle on this ranch had turned into something bigger, something that mattered to people far beyond my fence lines. In the quiet that followed, life on the ranch settled back into its rhythm. The cattle grazed. The horses ran free. The crops flourished under the summer sun. I sat on my porch at night, listening to the cicadas, sipping coffee, and reflecting on the storm that had passed. Karen was gone, her empire dismantled, her name now synonymous with failure. Yet in her downfall, I had found strength I didn't realize I had, the patience to endure, the resolve to protect, and the wisdom to act when the time was right. The land had taught me those lessons long before she ever showed up, but sometimes it takes a storm to remind you of what you already know. And as I looked out over the fields, stretching endlessly under the twilight sky, I knew one thing for certain: this ranch, this land, this legacy would never bow to anyone, least of all a self-appointed queen with a clipboard. Not now. Not ever. The seasons turned as they always do, the land reminding me that time moves forward no matter what storms come and go. By autumn, the Karen saga was no longer the talk of the town but a story people recalled with a mix of disbelief and humor. Folks would shake their heads and laugh, retelling how she had tried to evict a man from his own ranch without realizing he governed every HOA in the nation. Her name became a cautionary tale whispered in homeowners' meetings, a reminder of what happens when arrogance collides with authority it cannot defeat. For me, life returned to its natural rhythm: early mornings with the cattle, afternoons repairing fences or baling hay, evenings sitting on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon. Yet even in the peace, I carried with me the lessons of the battle I'd fought, not just against Karen, but against the very idea that someone could strip a man of his heritage with paperwork and bluster. It reaffirmed what I'd always known: land isn't just property, it's identity, it's history, it's blood. And no HOA, no Karen, no clipboard warrior would ever take that from me. But even as life returned to normal, I began to notice the ripple effect of what had happened. Across the state, and even across the country, HOA boards were suddenly under scrutiny. Homeowners, emboldened by the downfall of one of the most notorious presidents in recent memory, started pushing back against unreasonable fines and arbitrary rules. News outlets picked up on the story, spinning headlines about the rancher who broke the HOA tyranny and the federal judge who took on Karen. I never sought the spotlight, but I couldn't stop it from finding me. Journalists called, asking for interviews. TV crews wanted to film segments at the ranch. Activists wrote me letters, thanking me for giving them courage to stand up against their own neighborhood dictators. At first, I turned them all away, content to let the story die quietly. But then I realized something. Karen's fight with me had exposed a larger truth. HOAs, once intended to maintain order and protect property values, had grown into unchecked fiefdoms in many parts of the country. And if my experience could shine a light on that, then maybe it was worth stepping into the public eye, if only for a moment. So I agreed to a few interviews. I sat in front of cameras, not in a suit or polished shoes, but in the same dusty boots and hat I wore every day. I spoke plainly, the way ranchers do, about the importance of balance, how HOAs could serve a purpose but needed oversight, transparency, and accountability. I told them about Karen, about the fire she set, about the forged papers, about the years of abuse she inflicted on homeowners. But I didn't just talk about her. I talked about the bigger picture, about freedom, about heritage, about the right of every American to live without fear of being bullied in their own home. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from across the country, veterans, farmers, teachers, single mothers, people who had been harassed by their HOAs, people who had felt powerless until they heard my story. Some wrote to say they finally had hope. Others wrote to ask for help. And though I couldn't answer every letter, I read them all, each one a reminder that what happened on my ranch had sparked something far bigger than I ever imagined. Meanwhile, Karen's trial moved forward. The charges against her stacked high: fraud, embezzlement, harassment, attempted arson, and more. The courtroom was packed the day she faced the judge, her once confident posture now wilted under the weight of her crimes. Witness after witness took the stand, homeowners she had bullied, officials she had lied to, even former allies who had turned against her. When it was my turn, I testified not with anger but with clarity. I described the harassment, the fire, the forged documents. I showed the evidence I had carefully documented over the months. And when the defense tried to paint me as an overzealous landowner, I simply pulled out the same federal credentials that had silenced Karen time and again. The jury didn't take long to deliberate. Guilty on all counts. When the sentence was read, years in prison, fines that would strip her of every ill-gotten gain, Karen's face crumpled into something I had never seen before, not arrogance, not anger, but defeat. For the first time, she realized she had lost. Not just to me, but to the truth, to justice, to the very system she thought she could manipulate. After the trial, I returned home to the ranch, where life had continued without pause. The cattle didn't care about courtrooms. The fields didn't stop growing because of legal battles. The ranch reminded me, as it always did, that life is steady, enduring, bigger than any one person's drama. Yet something inside me had shifted. I no longer saw myself as just a rancher. I was a steward, not just of my land, but of a principle, a belief that ordinary people could stand against those who abused power. And though I didn't seek fame or recognition, I couldn't deny that Karen's downfall had lit a fire in others. Homeowners began organizing, pushing for reform in their HOAs. Lawmakers started drafting bills for stricter oversight. And in the quiet moments, sitting on my porch with coffee in hand, I felt a strange sense of peace knowing that my battle hadn't been in vain. What began as one woman's obsession had become a movement, and though I didn't plan it, I was proud to have played my part. As winter settled in and the snow dusted the fields, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. Karen was gone, her empire destroyed, her name forever tarnished. The community was free from her grip, and HOAs nationwide were under new scrutiny. But for me, the most important thing was simpler: my ranch was safe. My family's legacy remained intact. The barns still stood, the fences still lined the fields, the horses still ran under the open sky. The land had weathered the storm, just as it had weathered countless storms before. And I knew, deep down, that it always would. Because this ranch wasn't just mine, it was a symbol of resilience, of independence, of the American spirit. And no Karen, no HOA, no bureaucrat would ever change that. And so, as the fire crackled in the hearth and the cold wind swept across the plains, I leaned back in my chair, tipped my hat low, and let the weight of it all wash away. The fight was over. The land was mine. And it always would be.